Hello, and welcome back to Cartoon Aesthetics. We have with us today a very special guest, Mr. Bill Wray. How's it going, Bill?
Oh, me. Yes. Things are going rather well. How about for you? How's your day going?
My day's going pretty well, and yeah, Bill's a hard guy to give a short introduction to because, as the cliche goes, he's a real Renaissance man. He's one of those extremely rare artists who's done great work in comics, in animation, illustration, and in fine art. And I think his creative success in all of those fields is due in large part to how his knowledge of each art form informs the others. If you're a fan of Ren and Stimpy, I'm sure you know Bill's name. He was the head of the background department for the entire original series on Nickelodeon, which was one of the most revolutionary things about it. He painted many of the backgrounds himself, many of the episode title cards, and many of those infamous gross-up paintings they would use when they wanted to show something like rotten teeth or bloodshot eyes in extreme close-up. Later on in the series, Bill became a writer and directed some episodes himself. The other series, which I think most people have probably seen Bill's paintings in, is Samurai Jack, which was an amazing looking show, and he did a lot of the background art on that as well. When it comes to comics, I think the series which Bill's most famous for was a brilliant, beautifully drawn comic strip he did for Mad Magazine called Monroe about an angsty teenager, which started in the late 90s and ran for 10 years. And for the past 20 years or so, Bill has mostly been focused on fine art painting, and his paintings are a really compelling blend of both expressionism and realism, which I think fans of his cartooning can also appreciate because there's such a foundational knowledge of art in his cartooning. And in a way, I think he's always been kind of blending expressionism with realism. And when it comes to giving interviews, he's certainly done his share over the years already. So, Bill, I really appreciate you taking time out from your day to be here and just to let your fans hear you talk and let us learn more about your career. Thanks for being here today.
Well, you're going to have a hard time getting me to shut up because it's my favorite subject.
Yeah, was that a long enough introduction? All right.
Yeah.
Uh,
Can I make a couple slight corrections on that?
oh, please.
It's not really corrections. Everything's correct, but for instance, Samurai Jack, I was on Samurai Jack a very short time because I got my own pilot at the same time, and I had to choose between the two. So I got Scott Wills to take over, and really had only just begun it and did the title art, and that was about it until my pilot didn't get picked up, and then I came back and I freelanced some shows for Scott. So it was turnabout. Now he was my boss, and he it's all him really. He set the tone for that show. I was starting to set the tone, and then I got him there, and we worked together for a little while, and we put our heads together. But it was his baby, and you pretty much made it clear on Ren and Stimpy. But I was not the head of background all through the games years, just the first year, and then I gave that to Scott to do so I could direct and write.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for clearing the record on that. Before we talk about animation stuff, I wanted to start by asking you about your comics work because I think some of your fans might not know that your cartooning career actually began in comics, and some of your first credits were on mainstream fantasy adventure stuff at Marvel Comics and also Tarzan Comics by Russ Manning, who was one of the last of the old school adventure strip artists. But what I wanted to ask about when it comes to your early comics, some of your other early credits were on underground comics with publishers like Last Gasp and Kitchen Sink Press. And I think your cartooning and your sense of humor have always reflected a kind of underground comics sensibility. And it's especially there whenever you've done your own comics like Big Blown Baby or Hellboy Jr. And you did a book just a few years ago called Happy Comics, which really felt like an old-fashioned underground comic like Robert Crumb. Could you please describe for us the impact that underground comics had on you as a young cartoonist?
Well, it was it was vast, but just sort of bring it back to the very beginning of that. In a way, that Wally Wood's magazine called Wits End, you're probably familiar with it. That was sort of one of the beginning points of the underground, even though it wasn't distributed by a rip-off press or someplace like that. It was the first time I'd seen Von Baudet's work, and the cover of the magazine, I was still being, I think I was still having my teeth worked on in Hollywood because my mom found a cheap dentist, and she would reward me because he was so old, he would always hurt me every session. So she would drop me off on Hollywood Boulevard, and I would go to Collector's Bookstore, and I looked in the window and I saw the cover of this issue of Wits End, and it showed this masked creature, very cartoony, blowing the brains out of a girl tied to a post. And I was just like dumbfounded. I had never seen that level of violence anywhere. But what intrigued me was that he did it in a cartoon style, and that softened it somehow, but also just made it completely different. And so I looked in my pocket and I had a quarter, and I think it was like $1.25 or something like that. So I went into the store and I simply shoplifted it. I had to have it that bad. And around that same time, I had a friend who I palled around with in junior high school, and I was going over to his house, and his older brother was into comics, and I was still reading Spider-Man then. And he goes, "You ever heard of underground comics?" And he hands me a copy of Zap, and I think it had that story Joe Blow, which today couldn't be printed, but back then everything was kind of anarchy in publishing. And Robert Crumb just became this hero of mine, and I went back and got the back issues, and I really feel like I probably owe everything to that guy. I really wish that I'd gotten a chance to meet him at some point, but that's never happened. But I made sure he got a copy of Happy Comics, and I was really hoping I might hear from him, but I didn't.
Oh, that's cool. Did you have his somebody gave you his address in France or something?
Craig Yo, the publisher and artist himself, is friends with Crumb, so he made sure that he got one. So
nice. That's nice. Speaking of Crumb, something unsavory that I have to ask you about on behalf of my fellow Spumco fans. In the early 80s, just a few years into your comics and animation careers, you once inked a rather infamous one-page pornographic parody of the Flintstones, which John Kricfalusi drew, called Cave Nudes, featuring Fred and Wilma and Arnold the Paperboy, shades of Joe Blow in that comic, certainly, which was eventually published in Robert Crumb's anthology series, Weirdo Magazine, in 83. I read on some website that it was a colleague of yours named Jeff John who actually submitted it to Weirdo and to Peter Bagg, who was the editor of Weirdo. Did you and John know that he had even sent that in, or did it come as a surprise to see that show up in Weirdo?
It was a surprise. I'm remembering that, but that's so long ago. I'm pretty sure it was a surprise. At least for me. If I had a discussion with John about it, I don't remember it. But it was very gratifying to see it in there, because that was exactly like what Weirdo was all about. Just this offbeat shit. We did that. John drew it and I inked it, and we surreptitiously put it up all over Hanna-Barbera just to fuck with everybody.
Well, I got to tell you, even today, that thing still gets passed around sometimes on the internet. It's had an amazing shelf life. The other influence that I wanted to talk about was EC Comics, because I think there's a lot of shades of EC in your work, and they had a lot of artists who I think, like yourself, could do both funny cartooning and then also more realistic, stylized illustration. Like they could do Tales from the Crypt, and then they could also do Mad. Guys like Wally Wood, Will Elder, Jack Davis. Can you describe for us the impression that EC Comics left on you?
Well, the first East, just technically EC, of course, was Mad Magazine, but Mad Magazine of the 70s, early 70s, when I was still a teenager as well. A neighborhood kid who was kind of a ne'er-do-well in a family of ne'er-do-wells. We would go out hunting all the time, and the parents were both on LSD therapy for their marriage, and shit would always happen. And I'm so glad I wasn't killed, because one day the son's shotgun accidentally went off and shot his dad. Another time at the house, he was fucking around with his shotgun, and his mother said, "Put that goddamn thing away. How many times do you have to be told?" And he goes, "It's empty." And he just blows a hole in the wall as he squeezes a trigger. It's empty. And this is the guy I was hanging out with, and he's the one who showed me Mad Magazine. And then I was completely hooked. And then I thought, how do I get more of these? And so I went to a little bookstore nearby and found back issues and just started collecting those. And then more and more, I discovered there was a comic book fan thing, and you could get back issues. I noticed in a comic book, Robert Bell and Howard Rogowski, you could get these back issues of comics. And I'm not quite sure the first time I saw an EC, but it was definitely a Tales from the Crypt. Pretty sure it was the Jack Davis cover with the axe chopping. And yeah, I had to have all of them after that, although I couldn't really afford them. So I got poor condition copies. But EC had a profound effect on me. And I absolutely loathed the TV show that came out on it, because it just didn't even come anywhere near it. But yeah, and I'm still not over it. We haven't gotten to it yet, but there's more. Maybe I should wait, but just briefly, there's Happy Comics in production right now. I've basically got 4 issues done, but there's at least 1 or 2 stories that have an EC twist to them, because it's not something that's ever going to leave me.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know you were making more Happy Comics.
Oh, yeah.
That's great. That's great to hear. I'm sure you've probably heard your cartooning compared to Harvey Kurtzman's a million times, right?
Well, I was straight up ripping him off. So
well, there you go. Okay.
And I traded one of the prized possessions in my collection. I had the original art for that Russ Heath National Lampoon story called Cowgirls at War. And it's tanks and sexy girls on, sexy Nazi girls. And Heath having the time of his life, putting his all into it. And I had a guy find me who's a collector who said, I understand you're looking for Kurtzman. You want that early period, like, hey, look. And I'm like, yes. He says, well, I don't have that. I have a strip that was done a little bit after that, and it was a thing called Sheldon. So I traded for that one page, that whole Heath story. I kept one page, I think. And I still have the Sheldon page, and it's that nice, solid but loose, super cartoony style of his that was my very favorite that he ever did.
Yeah. Well, I think the comparison is warranted because, Harvey Kurtzman was capable of doing dramatic cartoon realism like in his war comics. Yeah. But then he could also just, do the pure humor cartooning in Mad like it was nothing. But he had a strong enough personal style that came through no matter what he was doing. Whatever genre. Well, related to EC Comics, I think the coolest stuff you were doing in that early 80s period was the stuff you were drawing for Pacific Comics. And for those of you listening who don't know them, Pacific Comics was an independent publisher which, among other things, put out some sci-fi and horror anthologies in the tradition of EC Comics, but updated for the 80s. And the title which Bill contributed the most to was their horror series, Twisted Tales, where he illustrated stories by Bruce Jones. Can you tell us a bit about how you started working for Bruce Jones and Pacific Comics?
That was a huge break for me from Bruce Jones. Let's see. How did that happen? How did he discover me? I should remember this. I think somebody recommended me. I don't know who. It might have been Dave Stevens, it might have been.
I know you had some associations with William Stout, who I think did some work for Pacific as
Well,
well.
unfortunately, by then, Stout and I were not on good terms. So I don't see him recommending me, but who knows? But anyway, yeah, that was my first shot at doing my own solo stories. And that was so much fun. I was so crushed when they stopped doing the book because I was, it was my first time I was doing enough stories where I was kind of make my living off of that and not have to do some of the shittier animation work, like work at Hanna-Barbera and stuff like that. And I decided because of the strength of getting those stories, I would move to New York and go to school there at the Art Students League and learn how to paint and draw, better than I knew how at that point. And when I got there, then Bruce, I think I did one or two more stories. Then Bruce said, well, I'm not going to be doing those anymore. I'm going to be making movies now. And it's such a small world. I was lucky I was renting a room in this loft. And he had just given me that news that he was doing that Somerset Holmes thing that was from Eclipse 2. And he was talking to Jamie Lee Curtis, or the movie company was, or whoever was. And like 24 hours later, my girlfriend says, can you bring us home a bottle of wine tonight? Because my studio was separate from her apartment. And I go down to the liquor store just below my place. It's a high-end wine place. And there's Jamie Lee Curtis standing in line. And this happened to me my whole life. I could tell you a million stories. I don't know why, but it did. And I just walk up to her because I'm like, hey, I understand that you're doing this, doing Somerset Holmes with Bruce Jones. And she's like, what? Huh? What? It's a comic book that they're adapting into a movie and you're considering being in it. I am? And I'm like, uh-oh, I might have.
Yeah.
I was so young and naive. She just thought I was kind of a weirdo and just, until at some point she just clicked into, just go along with this, And then, I don't even know, I can't remember if I told Bruce this story or not, but I think he took it pretty well, but it was like I might have had a little something to do with why it didn't come together. I don't know, But she ended up not doing it.
Yeah.
But
well, when you were illustrating Bruce's stories on Twisted Tales, were his comic scripts pretty specific about this is going to be in this panel, this is what's going to happen in the next panel, or did he kind of hand you they were pretty specific to work from?
They were full scripts. And I didn't deviate. I wasn't. Two things. I wasn't that. Well, that's not true. There was once or twice, because I've always been this way, where I called him and I suggested a slight change, or a what if this ending was a little bit more like that. And generally, I seem to remember him just going along with it. Saying that's not too bad an idea. Sure. And it probably was just another idea. But he's just a generous guy, So
yeah. Later on, after Pacific Comics went out of business and had to sell some of their titles to a company called Eclipse Comics, I understand you had some troubles with the editor there at Eclipse on the sci-fi and horror stuff. Like she was not so hot on the sex and violence aspects.
Well, it was funny because I did a couple short stories without there being a problem because there was no sexual situations in them. But I this one story came, it was called Nada, and it was written by a fairly unknown science fiction writer, the theme being one that was visited by Hollywood many times, where aliens had taken or taking over some people with mind control, variation on the Body Snatchers or whatever. And I'm reading this, they give it to me and they say, well, there's some problem. We could see there's problems with the structure because he doesn't understand comics. And this was this would haunt me the rest of my career in good ways and bad. Can you take it and make it work? See, so when people do that to me, they don't know that means I'm going to do that. And so I saw what he had there, and the visuals for it I thought were boring. Like he had him shoot the aliens with this little tiny dart gun, and I'm like, no. I turned that into an Uzi, and then there was a scene where what had happened is that he had gotten unhypnotized by seeing a hypnosis show, where it's somehow in the process of being snapped out of his hypnosis, he suddenly could see where the aliens were. And so he said, well, I got hypnotized. I got out of it because of, I was snapped out of it. And basically the person slapped his face and because he wasn't coming out of it. And he shows up at his girlfriend's house for a date, and the girlfriend is there. I presented her as being in a seductive situation, like semi-nude, and that wasn't in the script. And Kat Ironwood, being a woman who's very much about women's issues, stated to me, well, basically, reading at this tells me that you're probably a rapist. and it just says it's a symbol when a man is dressed and a woman is naked or partially naked, that represents symbolizing rape. Because what had happened is that I had him slap her to snap, because that was in the story, to snap her out of it. And this is, mind you, this is a time when Richard Corbin was working for them. And they weren't telling him to cover up tits, So it was like, I thought, hey, anything goes. This is what and in fact, the business did keep leaning toward more and more nudity at that time. If you're a younger guy, but if you remember, there in comic shops, they even had to have a section that expanded the underground section because of all the different magazines, and heavy metal was pushing it, and everything else was pushing edgy, sexy stuff. Mm-hmm. So I didn't see it being a problem. And, well, Kat sure did. And so she censored that panel. And I completely changed the ending of the story. His girlfriend, this is another, just a random couple. We cut to a series of shots of people snapping out of their stupor. And one of them is, the last shot is a guy's girlfriend's riding him, and all of a sudden she's a hideous alien. And she objected to that too, but left it in after much arguing. What happened is that somehow John Carpenter saw that comic book story, and that turned it into the movie They Live. Mm-hmm. And there were other little spots I rewrote. Everything I rewrote was in the movie, including that ending. And the tone that I'd put into it, which visually was, I'd made it like this oppressed, Stalin-like era Russian buildings and all this other stuff. And everything about the art direction of it was there. And he used shotguns instead of machine guns. Okay. But he discarded the idea of the dart too. If he ever saw the original story, I don't know. They must have, because they bought the rights to it. When I didn't know about this, that it had been optioned. And I was in a comic book store, and I'm looking at a news magazine, and it talks about how Nada by so-and-so and Bill Wray is going to be in a movie. And I'm like, I call up Eclipse and I said, you guys don't have the courtesy to tell me this? Are you fucking kidding me? And, well, we don't legally have any reason to do it. Well, how about morally?
Yeah.
How about just as being a nice guy? Well, of course, since things had ended a little bit in an ugly way with me and Kat, Dean Mulaney was going to, defend her, of course, by just being passive aggressive with me. And I just said, well, he says, read your contract. There's nothing in there that I said, I rewrote it. You guys know I did. Well, that was your choice, but it's not mentioned contractually one way or the other. And the only thing you could do is if John Carpenter used your alien design, then he'd have to pay you for that. But he changed the alien design into something easier to do.
Yeah.
So I was shit out of luck. I called up the writer because I just thought, let's see if he has a conscience, dude, all these elements of the changes that you and Kat didn't like are in the movie. So don't you think that maybe I deserve a little money? And he said with great embarrassment that he'd only been paid a few $1,000s for the rights.
Wow.
And he says that Forrest Ackerman, the old publisher editor of fantastic, Famous Monsters of Filmland, had quit being his agent because he had done the deal without Forrest Ackerman, which of course was absolutely stupid. Clearly he could have gotten $10,000 to $20,000 or more,
Yeah.
This is a pretty long time ago. So it's not, nobody's handing out $1 million deals then, but so it's like, what am I going to sue him for? This guy's an idiot too. So the whole story behind it all is kind of a little bit of a bitter memory, as you can.
I mean, I think it's one of your best works from that whole period. And I was shocked when I was doing research and saw that in the September 1988 issue of American Cinematographer, Carpenter, he doesn't mention you by name, but he actually says, here's the quote, "They Live began 3 years ago," this is 1988, "with a comic book I bought called Nada. It was published by Eclipse Comics, a company which puts out very beautifully rendered science fiction stories. This particular strip was taken from a short story called 8 O'Clock in the Morning by Ray Nelson." I mean, he who was the author of the story in 8 O'Clock in the Morning. Yeah, but I didn't even think think it was ever acknowledged at all, your input. Just the fact that inadvertently you're sort of responsible for that movie's whole existence, because Carpenter says himself he wanted to do the movie because he read your comic. So I thought that was quite interesting. On the subject of, going back to horror again, you were doing a lot of horror comics in the 80s. There was another anthology title called Taboo, where you illustrated stories for Alan Moore and Ramsey Campbell. You contributed to a horror anthology at DC called Wasteland. You had a story in the Hellraiser anthology comic. Clearly, you love the genre, and you've mentioned more than once in print how you'd really love to do an animated horror film, which I think would be incredible. Could you tell us what you would want to do with an animated horror film that maybe couldn't be achieved in just live action?
Well, I just thought that it never made any sense to me that everything had to be Disney, that everything had to be Warner Brothers, everything had to be for kids if it was animated. All you had to do is look over to Japan or wherever else and just see there's this untapped potential. And me and my writing partner, Jim Gomez, we just always just said, why isn't there an animated horror film? It's going to happen sooner or later. And it still really hasn't happened here. Not really, anime style stuff with samurai girls killing vampires or whatever, well, I guess would qualify for horror, but that to me is already just a copy of what Japan's been doing forever. But I just mean just an original, dark, they had one way they could do it would be maybe animate Hellboy or something. But I mean, but I just think there should be. I don't have original plot to trot out to you about it. It just seems like a natural, because you can see the horror movie almost got its start with Pinocchio, and they toned it down, but it's still terrifying to children. And it's just like they toned things down after that because they didn't want to terrify children. And I'm just like, why? That sells tickets. It doesn't make any sense. But they just turned into such a children's brand, and they were so afraid of moms. And then that whole thing happened in the 60s where all the cartoons got censored and cut to mollify mothers who had organized and were threatening protests against the television stations. So they started cutting all the violence, the destructive violence, out of cartoons, which just ruined them, you know?
Yeah.
And that was the thing we were the most proud of about Ren and Stimpy, is that we brought, not completely back, but we brought a lot of that stuff back. And The Simpsons and us, we changed it. We changed the animation. I wish that I could say it was mine. It's not. I was just an art director there. John and I were friends a long time before it, and we were technically partners before I decided, when we were trying to sell all kinds of things, including an early version of Ren and Stimpy. But then we couldn't get anything sold. There wasn't enough cable. There wasn't enough anything. And we were too adult, too this, too that. So I just decided to go be a painter in New York and learn how to draw better. And he stuck with it. Before we left, I don't know if you know about this cartoon. It's a cartoon called Ted the Chicken. Have you ever seen it?
Ted Bakes one.
Yeah.
It's on YouTube.
That was done way before Ren and Stimpy. And that was me and John. I was hired to do the whole thing. And well, he was my best friend at the time and kind of a partner at that point too. And I knew he was the genius. And so I could have directed it, but I let him direct it. And we both wrote it together. And in fact, I think I wrote it. But it ended up not being, we ran out of time and money, so we didn't really complete it. So it's kind of like it's just this little brief title opening instead of a more story-based sort of thing. That was able to get John a job. I forget the order of it now, but what that was the genesis, that he was able to show people he did something, which got him the job at the Jetsons, which got him the job at Beanie and Cecil, which got him the job at Mighty Mouse. You know, however the order of those things went, until ultimately Ren and Stimpy came along, and I was still in New York. And he had offered me a job on Mighty Mouse, and I quoted him $500 a week, which was way too much money back then. So I didn't want to come out. I was happy in New York. But what he did, Ren and Stimpy, I always promised him that if he could sell that, I'll come back and work on it, because I knew then we were going to change the face of animation. Sounds egotistical, but I knew it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's true, and you're so right about the untapped potential of animation when it comes to horror. I mean, you mentioned Pinocchio. The scary scenes in those classic Disney movies are really scary, and in Ren and Stimpy, there are scary scenes too, and that's something that I think people probably hadn't seen in animation since the scary scenes in Snow White or Fantasia or what have you. Episodes like Hermit Wren.
That was one of my stories, so
nice. Yeah.
I wrote it with Jim and Bob worked on it a little too, but that was my genesis.
Yeah. The mummified bog man, the scene. I'd like to take a step back and ask about your early animation career for a moment, because you first entered animation in the late 70s, not long after getting into professional comics, but you didn't stay there because that was really the dark ages. In 84, you quit and moved to New York because Ren and Stimpy was years away, and it didn't seem like there was any sign the industry was going to improve. My question about that is that you must have known at the time that you were kind of entering an industry that had already been in a deep decline. Like, all you had to do was turn on the TV to see how much it had devolved. So what motivated you to enter the animation business at all that first time around, when you must have known it would be a creative dead end on some level?
Well, it was because there wasn't a whole lot of work in California for a cartoonist but that. And, if you wanted to work in comics, you had to move to New York. You didn't do stuff freelance, except in that one case of working for Russ Manning, but that's not your question. But it was just, I had a mentor in animation. The guy's name was George Gepper. And he was an unknown but important Disney guy who did a lot of animation on the major features, but he was also a sculptor for them. So he did a lot of sculptures of all the characters for the animators to draw from. And he also did many of the sculptures for those. I don't know if you've ever seen them or know what these are, but the soaky foam for kids playing in bathtubs, and they were all the Hanna-Barbera characters and
Okay.
other things, Batman, whatever it was. But anyway, he was this amazing sculptor and animator. I had answered an ad in Orange County. I was 15, I think. They were looking for animators, people to be trained as animators. This guy wanted to break into doing feature films. He was a naive guy, but he did little industrial shorts. And he hired George to train a bunch of us green kids and some adults to do animation there. And we actually worked on these industrial shorts of this guy's stuff. And then George, that never went anywhere. And George remained a friend. And he just said, why don't you go over to Hanna-Barbera and see if you can get a job in betweening? So I went over there and I got a job, and I was in betweening on Godzilla, I think it was, and hated it. I could see how maybe being an animator would be more interesting, but it didn't seem like a career goal to me. This idea of spending days just to work out one little movement, I just didn't have the patience for that.
Yeah.
I got a shot at doing a storyboard by Doug Wildey, probably because of Dave Stevens saying something nice about me too in that case. And Doug and I hit it off. He was a jokester, I was a jokester, full on both pranksters. And I did this storyboard. It was thumbnailed out by an older pro there, and I finished it, and there was a scene where this giant cat, it was Jan of the Jungle, which was the in-between cartoon of Godzilla, I believe. They do that old, you'll know that, you'll probably know the story. A lion gets a thorn in its paw. And so Jan pulls the thorn out of the lion's paw, so then they're friends. And just for a joke, because I was still only in the middle of the thing, I drew a fake panel over the top that when she pulled the thorn out, this geyser of blood came out like Monty Python style. Mm-hmm. And right underneath it was the proper panel. So you just lifted it up and there it was. And I had to work like 3 or 4 days at the end, all night to get it done. And I came into Doug's office and I had totally dead and I had completely forgotten about the joke. And he was so late, he just went looking at, yep, good. Not too bad for your first job, kid. Now go home and get some sleep. And then the next morning I get this call from an angry Doug Wildey. Well, long story short, he had not noticed that panel with the bloody paw, and I had forgotten it, but the network sure noticed. And the problem was, it wasn't just like he could call him back and say, we'll just lift up the panel. It was a joke. We forgot to take it off. My apologies.
Yeah.
But it was like, since he didn't see it, and Doug is always right, that was a thing about him, he told them off. Like, there's no fucking way I would allow something like that on one of my storyboards. Are you guys nuts? So he got into some shit. And when they showed it to him, and he called me in and just said, you're fired and you're never working here again. But Doug, it was a joke, and I was sleepy, and I was like, fuck off. And all the rest of my life, I had to listen about what a wonderful guy Doug Wildey was, because he's like a saint in the business. And Dave Stevens was my best friend at that time, and loved the man. And, Rick Holbrook loved the man. Everybody did. And like, that was kind of my lot in life. A lot of times I'd find a way to fuck up a perfectly good thing, consciously or unconsciously. But that business, he blackballed me at Hanna-Barbera. I tried to get on another show, and I was hired, and the guy liked me. And then he goes, wait a minute, what would you say your name is again? Bill Wray. And I knew I was doomed. And he was gone for a good long time, like 15 minutes. So this guy had a real talk with Doug. And it was like, I'm sure he said, because Don Morgan, he was a nice guy. He liked me. I liked him. He's a talented cartoonist. He used to go to the Pogo Sunday comic strip. And I bought a bunch of Pogo art from him ultimately. But he comes back and he's embarrassed looking and he says, I can't hire you. And I said, why? And he says, I can't say why, because of course he can get sued. So I just said, was it Doug Wildey? And he goes, he just shrugs his shoulders. He won't answer. He won't talk. He just like has this sort of embarrassed smile on his face. And I go, okay, it was Doug Wildey. And I just left. And that's when I said, you know what? Fuck this animation business. And that was one of the fulcrums of going to New York.
Once you were,
but I caused that problem, you know.
Yeah,
I own it, you know.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Once you were on the inside of the business and you could kind of see how the sausage got made, what struck you as the biggest problems that were making the industry so dysfunctional at that time?
Well, again, it was that trying to please the moms out there, toning everything down, not having violence in cartoons. That's fucking insane. That's all kids are about.
Yep.
There is no sibling that hasn't spent half his time with his brother or sister fighting each other. And there's no couple living together who doesn't fight. You know, it's just like, that's what people do. But cartoons, which are supposed to be an outlet for this kind of thing, are accused of causing it. And it's like, no, it's just a reflection of society parodied in a funny way. But these women got these jobs. It's sexist to identify them, but it's in fact what they were. And they would put out these lists of all the things that you can't do. And we at the studios would have to, okay, we can't do this. You know?
Yeah.
You can't have a spear in a native's hand. I mean, you can't point the spear at somebody. Okay, well, we won't point the spear at somebody. Well, they liked their jobs. It felt good to be paid to tell people what to do and censor things. So next year, instead of saying, well, they've given us a list of things we can't do, we're good to go from here. No, there would be a new list. And now it would be, okay, before it was you can't point a spear. Now you can't even hold a spear. Apparently spears don't exist. You know, So that's what it went like. And that's what destroyed it all.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day people woke up at Nickelodeon and somehow, and it was all women, didn't realize that that kind of stuff was a problem because they were intelligent. They were thinking people.
Yeah.
And they remember cartoons when they were young that they were wacky and violent, like Bugs Bunny or whatever. So when we brought in a certain element of that, they didn't flinch. Now, they flinched at other times when John really pushed it. You know, that's a whole other story. But they just didn't know that they weren't supposed to like it because we made them laugh. So they thought it was good and they were right. Yeah. And they weren't literally afraid of success. And it came to them really fast. You know, we were still in the first season when it just started to be shown. And we got an immediate call from Golden Apple Comics. And they said, would you guys do a signing? And they were like, what? People know about it? It had barely been on the air. And yeah, oh yeah, you got fans. Oh, that's okay. We walked into that place. And it still kind of chokes me up a little bit. They're singing the log song, the entire room, with this line out the fucking door. And we just couldn't believe it. You know?
Yeah.
And then John had to fuck it up. He couldn't stand the success. Anyway.
Well, once you got out of that scene and you got to New York and you were doing a lot of work at DC, it seems like that must have been a really exciting time to be there because there was Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns were getting a lot of attention. And there was also just a lot of new talent coming in, but also some of the old legends were still around. And DC was trying a lot of new things in terms of what they allowed in stories and the variety of art styles that they would let the artists do. Did you feel when you started working there that you had arrived at a good creative time at the company?
Oh yeah. Well, when I came in there, they were doing uh, their regular, stuff, but they were experimenting more and more with different formats, and that's when what was Karen Berger's line of comics?
Oh,
Piranha
Vertigo.
Press, Vertigo. Piranha Press was the first iteration of that, I believe, but that hadn't quite happened yet. And I was selling myself as an inker. I was working for a guy named Greg Theakston, who was did some inking work for them too. Was kind of a notorious character. He had his own printing press, and he would do bootleg fanzines of like Bernie Wrightson and Frazetta and all these other things. But he was offering me a job, and so I think the first thing I did at DC was I helped him color a couple graphic novels. One was a thing that Keith Geffen did, Robert Bloch's story,
Mm-hmm.
Hell on Earth
Mm-hmm.
was the name of it, and then a big Kirby book called Hunger Dogs. And so we would go back and forth to DC, and he very generously introduced me to them, and I showed them samples, and I got a chance to ink the Justice League, and I inked that for quite some time. And then at a certain point, I got to know Mike Gold, and I was working for Andy Helfer before, and Mike was letting me. I was working for Len Wein at first. They were doing those. What are those fucking comics called? It would just be a one pager with an old DC superhero redrawn by a current artist. The History of DC Comics, it was called. That's right. And so I got one of those to do, and then he started giving me inking to do, and then for whatever reason, I guess he's just saw some talent there. He had me pencil a question annual, and I was also doing some inking on Dennis Cowan on another. Was it another book, or was it the question as well? Oh, I think it was It was Green Arrow, but I'm not sure. But actually, I wasn't inking Dennis Cowan. He was having a guy ghost for me. I'm getting into too much minutia, but I was doing lots of odds and ends like that. But the thing that came along that was the most exciting was Wasteland, as you mentioned briefly. But unfortunately, I got onto it as it was on its way out, so I didn't get to do too much on that stuff.
Yeah, that was an anthology that was co-written by Del Close, the famous Upright Citizens Brigade founder, right?
And yeah, and he had a radio show too, and stuff like that back in Chicago. Remember?
Yeah, he was supposed to be kind of a nut, wasn't he?
That I didn't know. I never met him,
Hmm.
but I certainly enjoyed doing this stuff. And unfortunately, it was short-lived. And then so I was back to. Well, actually, what happened? This is one of those funny things. I don't know if you're aware of every DC superhero title, but I didn't realize that when I was inking Justice League, that they were set that my editor was planning on rebooting it. He knew he had a stale team, and he wanted to do something sensational. And but at that time I was offered Wasteland, and so I just thought, I don't think I can maintain a monthly schedule, because the penciling on Justice League was done by a good artist, Luke McDonald, but he didn't really like to draw backgrounds, and he had kind of a very simple style. And so Andy hired me to give it my Russ Heath thing, to put lots of shadows, lots of details in it. And so that's what I did. And after about 20 issues, or I don't know if it was that many, but it was close. And I was over it. And I came into him one day, and when I'd been offered Wasteland, and I was getting work from Mike Gold too, and I said, "Would you mind if I quit inking the book?" And he said, with a big smile on his face, he said, "I'd recommend that you stay on the book." He didn't beg me to be on it. He didn't get mad that I was off of it. He just said this with his wry smile on his face. "I'd strongly recommend you stay on the book. I don't think you'd regret it." And I didn't listen to him. I didn't catch the tone, because I was just set on doing this Wasteland thing. And I quit. So I quit the book, and I said, "No, sorry, I really don't want to do that and do it anymore." He said, "Okay." And a few months later, the rebooted version came out with a new artist, and it was written by Keith Geffen, and it was a new, edgier take on the Justice League, and it was penciled by a guy named Kevin McGuire, who was an instant fan favorite. And at that point, it was inked by Terry Austin, but if I'd stayed on the book, it would have been me. And that #1 did really well. So that would have been the first time I got a royalty or something. If they had royalties, then I'm not quite sure. But I had a way of doing shit like that, but I can even top that story. I was looking around. I was still getting ink work after Wasteland went. And I forget which editor this was. It might have been Andy again. I'm not sure. And I forget what comic it was. But I was offered the inks of it because it was a new guy and the work needed some help. And I was just like, "Oh, I help that other guy. Why am I always the fix-it guy?" Well, I was good at fixing it. And, and I just I started going over the panels and just said, "Well, look what he did here and look what he did there." And it's just like, "Well, you will make it look better." I said, "That's why I want to use you." And I'm like, "Yeah, I could, but, and I just was in a mood, and I said, "No, I don't want to do it." And I turn around behind me, and the penciler standing right there, he heard my whole put down of his work. And I sheepishly left the office and I muttered sorry to the guy or something. And they had Kevin Nolan ink the book. That was Joe Quesada. In 5 minutes, I made an enemy for life of a guy who I could have got to know, gone over to Marvel with, and done really well. That's my stupidity.
Yeah.
That's my bad luck.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's kind of why I've done so many different things.
Yeah. Right. You had to.
It's versatility, but it's also like, whoops, I did it again,
Yeah.
Stuck my foot deep in my mouth as far as it would go.
Well, one other thing I wanted to ask about your DC days was you mentioned Keith Giffen. There's an infamous comic you drew which never saw publication at DC about Lobo's dog. Apparently canceled because it had a scene with a concentration camp for dogs. Was that what the whole story was about, or what was that comic about?
Well, it was the main thrust of that first issue. Yeah, it was basically a doggy Auschwitz. And I couldn't fathom how Keith got that past Paul Levitz. I just, how did that happen? And the only thing I can think of is that Keith Paul somehow breezed through the writing and had so much trust for Keith that he just didn't notice. And because Keith's little scripted drawings, they basically were that. They were just drawings with little bits of dialogue, are so simple that you could miss something like that if you were breezing through it. And not only did I not miss it, I emphasized it because I knew that was the whole thing. And I said, well, it seems too on the nose to make the guy a Nazi. So I just made him this weird looking alien kind of proto-human that almost looked like a weird black guy or something. And at some point when I was almost done, Paul had seen the pencils and killed the whole book.
Yeah.
And what was a shame is that he never came to me. He never said, Bill, why did you do this? Or whatever. I just was off the book. And I was so mad that, I put my heart and soul into the pencils and really thought this was another chance for me to step up as being an important penciler in that universe instead of just this fix-it inker.
Mm-hmm.
And it really hurt me. And my pride was so wounded, they said, well, we're going to pay you for it. And I said, no, you're not paying me. I don't want it.
Wow.
That's how stubborn I was.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm keeping the pencils. And maybe one day I'll just redraw it enough to, publish it somewhere else or something, which I never did. But what could have been. And then that followed me because Keith asked me to do a Lobo book. He waited for a year or two, maybe even 3. After Lobo was a big hit with Bisley, and then Bisley wasn't wanting to do it anymore. So this is just before Dan Didio came aboard and pitched me to do the book. And Dan was okay with it. He was excited about it. And all of a sudden I heard, oh, Bill, you're out. So Paul Levitt's got wind.
This sounds familiar.
That was the end of me.
Yeah.
And Alex Horley did the book, and he's a talented artist, but I shouldn't talk shit about him, but that's me. I don't care. I just thought he was a little bit bland. He was now where I took the Bisley thing and tried to out Bisley, you know, which you can't really do except in tone, Yeah. So I never got to do my Lobo shot, and I really should have been given that chance. I was treated pretty badly by.
Yeah. There's a couple of pages from it floating around online. That whole story though reminds me of something you once commented about Ren and Stimpy, where it's like sometimes the intensity of the stories wouldn't come through in the script or the plot descriptions, but then once they had actually been rendered, then people looked at them and thought, "Oh my God, like we can't let this out." Like I guess that was the story with Man's Best Friend to some degree.
Well, it's the story with everything in animation and publishing and everything else. And that is a lot of the people who have objections to anything, who are on the top, they don't know what they're looking at when they read it. They breeze through scripts and they have no imagination to picture it. And then they look at storyboards, which are rougher, at least in the earlier days. They're much more finished out now. And they don't really see that stuff either. It's amazing if you're really not a trained editor artist type. Mm-hmm. You can look at drawings and they don't register in your brain. It's like you have to be shown that no, this character's head's being cut off. Oh, okay. Well, we can't do that, can we? But stuff would just go through all the way up to the finished state, and then they'd see it done and go, "Oh my God, what happened here?
Yeah.
Did those artists go insane? No, you approved this. No, I didn't." Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. It's crazy. The other comics of yours I wanted to ask about this period were with Cracked Magazine, and I think most people don't know this, even most comics readers, but in the mid to late 80s, the editor of Cracked Magazine was this guy named Michael Delfemin. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Delfemini. He went by a pen name that was a lot easier to say, Mort Todd.
Yes.
And he was only 23 years old, and he basically came out of the alternative comics scene at the time, which is what were calling them by then instead of underground comics. And there was about a 5-year period where he kind of turned Cracked Magazine into like an alternative comic book for kids, because if you look at the names of people who were contributing at that time, besides yourself, they had Peter Bagg, Dan Clowes, Rick Altergott, Bob Fingerman, Milton Knight. It was kind of the golden age of Cracked Magazine, if such a thing can be said to exist. Do you have any recollections about Mort Todd or that whole scene that he created there for a few years?
Oh, sure I do. And he got Don Martin over there.
Right. He stole Don Martin from Mad.
Yeah, because Don was ready to go, but yeah, he picked when the time was right. He also went over incognito and hung out with Bill Gaines, and Bill didn't know who he was. There's photos of them. Um, yeah, Mort was, which is what I prefer to call him. He was a unique character. He could be a really good guy, and he could be. I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but I'd say this whether he was alive or not. He could be a really good guy, and he could be really not a good guy at all.
Mm.
He's notorious for doing some pretty dangerous things. There was one loft party, and I don't know if they want me telling the story, so I'm not going to mention their names, but two very, very, very important animation people. Before, like us back in the day, they were trying to break into the business, had a party. And as a prank, quote unquote, Morton, a friend of his, set a fire at the bottom of their loft, which could have very well burned the building down if someone hadn't noticed it right away. And they may have done it knowing that someone would see it, but still, that's not a joke,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I didn't really know his background, but somebody told me he was from some kind of money. So there was sort of he'd always sort of had that sense of entitlement about him, but he had low self-esteem. So he would dress the most, I guess he thought he was being cool, but he would wear these ratty clothes that were falling off his body. And he had his issues. He stole an absolute ton of the original art, and then later on lost it all because he wasn't paying the bill in the storage locker, and nobody knows where all that artwork went, including a lot of my stuff. And, although I was able to get a lot back, and there was a period of time where he allowed us to say that we own the copyright on the stories. I don't know if that would stand up, but there's plenty of stories where it'll say copyright Bill Wray on it, and let other people do that. So it was like he's kind of this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He could be a great guy. He gave me lots of work. He came up with that back cover idea of Sylvester being a different celebrity, which was fun and bizarrely hard at the same time. Like, what's that demarcation point of making sure it's him and then making it look like the celebrity? Because if you remember, Alfred E. Newman really never changed. Maybe they would change his hair a little bit, clothing and stuff, and even skin tone, but he still looked like Alfred E. Newman, whereas I was distorting him quite a bit, distorting Sylvester, and he went with it. I don't think he ever made me make a change. And he wrote a lot of stories for me too. They weren't great, but they were pretty good. And we did do one story. I did one story with Robert Loren Fleming, the briefly amazing writer at DC who wrote a book called Thriller with Trevor Von Eaton and some other things. But he had terrible problems doing the actual work. Just blocked that way. But he wrote a Predator parody for me, and that's probably the best thing I ever did there. It's worth looking up if you care about the work. And then I also tried really, really hard at Elvis parody that Mike Mort wrote. That was like the Superman origin, only with Elvis.
That sounds pretty good. I'm gonna have to track that stuff down. It's not easy because old cracks do show up on eBay, but it's cracked. It hasn't been as exhaustively archived as Mad Magazine stuff.
No.
If we can turn now to Ren and Stimpy, I just wanted to ask about some odds and ends, things I haven't heard you speak about before. One of my all-time favorite segments that you created in the games years was the fake commercial for dog water, which I think is the best of the fake commercials from games.
I had nothing to do with that. That was written by a couple of writers. Vince was the name of one. I don't remember his last name.
Calandra?
Yeah, Vince Calandra. And his writing partner was Ron Hauge. And that was totally their story.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess there's some confusion there because you do have a writing and
I did
storyboarding.
another short called Cheese Fist. I don't know if you remember that one.
Yeah,
That's all me and DeStefano.
it really looks. Yeah, it's really designed in a DeStefano style, and it looks like his art.
Oh, he was my savior at Ren Stimpy, because well, I got him a job just before at Spumco, just before it imploded, and him and John didn't get along. John treated him really badly for whatever fucking reason. John, but also it may have partially been that Steven's a really sensitive guy, and he was a young kid, and he was out in California for the first time living on his own, and he was a little bit freaked out by all that, I think. And, so he was in a sensitive position, and John was hard on him. And so he had a terrible experience there. But we hired him immediately at games. And I was the worst artist who was directing at games by far. I had no idea how to really draw great cartooning. I just didn't. But I had the ability was in me unformed. It still needed to be formed and solidified. So I just did what I've always done. I just did it somehow. And what I could have been saved by is if the layout people that we had, if I'd gotten the best layout guys, nobody would know that my work was weak. But nobody wanted to work for me because my work was weak. They wanted to work for brilliant guys like Chris Riccardi. The three guys to me that were the tops, in Ren and Stimpy were, of course, John, Bob Camp, and Chris was right behind him or tied with Bob. Amazing artist and amazing sensibility but he was smart. He got it. He had been fired by John, and for an emotional reason, which I won't go into, and he didn't really want to work for us. He didn't want to be part of this whole thing because there was such negative publicity. John had convinced the fan world that we were scum, that it was Bob had caused him to be fired and all this shit, which was nonsense. But this is the legend he was burnishing. And so for Chris to come over, he just said, nah, I'm not going to do it. And it's just like, well, what if we offered you this much money? Oh, well, I will do it if you give me this much money. Oh God. Well, okay. Because we needed him. And then it was like, and I get more time. Oh, okay. So what happened with me was, and this happened with other artists too. Like I said, almost all I'd say there's maybe one or two directors who I could draw as well or better as, but not really much. And they got more time and they got all the best layout guys. But I got my shot I had no reason to be given a shot, really. But the thing was, this is what happens in scenarios like this. I got less time and nobody to help me. I had to do it all myself.
Yeah.
That's not totally true, but they would say like, well, there's these two Korean animators who've opened a shop, quote unquote, in Koreatown, and they've done animation for us, so we think they can do layout. And they couldn't. They're animators. Animators follow layouts, right? And so I was doing it all myself in a really crude, awkward way. And my first couple of cartoons really show it. And then DeStefano, I ended up really trying to get him on my team. And luckily, I figured out how I could do it. I couldn't have him lay out everything, but he would take my storyboards and I would draw them small, and he would go over them and fix the drawing. And all of a sudden, my cartoons started to look really good. But that was right at the end, and then the whole thing was gone.
Yeah. Well,
wait a minute. I think I just got off on a tangent. What was the question?
Well, I mean, originally I was asking you about Dog Water because somehow you wound up with writing credit on that, but I guess that's not really accurate. Maybe it was a little mix up.
We would work with Vince and Ron in the same room all the time. I don't think we ever let them work completely on their own, but that was one of the ones where they came to us with the premise. Mm-hmm. So I probably punched a joke or two or something. That would be about it.
Okay. My question about the games years in general is, did Bob Camp give you more freedom as the head of the background department than John did? Because I know Bob Camp was a painter too, so he probably had some ideas that differed with yours sometimes. Were there any creative clashes?
No, Bob was great. Our creative clashes came a little bit later when I was directing. But as a painter, when I came in, I said, I'm doing what I want if you want me to run the background department. And then I also said, I'll run it for a year, but then you got to let me direct. So I got some concessions too, although I wasn't paid as much as Chris was.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the cartoons you directed. Aloha Hoek, you have this crab family that shows up, and they bear a resemblance to the King Crab character you created a couple years later. This is a silly question, but do you have any particular fascination with crabs, or are they just fun to draw?
I guess so. The genesis of this whole thing, in one way or another, was the Flash Gordon actor Buster Crab. I always thought that was a hilarious name for an actor. And so King Crab was originally called Buster Crab, but Nickelodeon, our Cartoon Network, didn't want to risk that. But I can't say to you what was the thing that was the genesis for. I wasn't drawing pictures of crabs my whole childhood or anything. Probably just simply I wanted to do a cartoon animal that hadn't been done, as far as I could remember, as a main character.
Yeah. At the ending of Aloha Hoek, you have Ren and Stimpy revealed to be Soviet spies who are also Fred and Barney. It seems like both the Flintstones and the Soviet Union were like major reference points in the game's years, and often in episodes that you wrote on. Like there was the Fred Flintstone worm at the end of Ren's retirement. There was Space Dogged, where they're Soviet cosmonaut dogs. And with Soviet Fred and Barney, these two things come together. Were those fixations of yours, or was it just were there others that shared them at games?
Well, I always thought Stalin was misunderstood. No, I can't give you a concrete reason. It's just like sometimes a joke will pop into your head, like wouldn't it be funny if Fred and Barney sounded like communist, in a Russian accent? It's just like, yeah, it would be okay. And there would be no more thought to it than that. It's like, that's just how my brain works. My very latest comic that I just drew, a one-pager, I wanted to do a cartoon character thing that was much more sedate than all the rest of the stuff I'm doing. I wanted it to be a kind of a quiet thing, and multi-panel one-pager. I thought, what's an animal that hasn't been done? So the strip's called Norwal. As far as I know, nobody's done a Norwal character.
Mm-hmm.
And I just like doing that. That's like one way to kind of make it automatically fresh. When I was a teenager, I had a character called Jungle Duck, because it was like, I figured you're supposed to just copy I like Donald Duck, so I'll do that.
Yeah.
But now I try to spring from a little different well, even though everything is influenced by everything else.
I don't know if you have a favorite of the episodes that you directed, but I think the best of them is My Shiny Friend, because I remember watching it as a kid and actually being kind of affected by it because, like I'm a kid, but if there's one addiction that I could relate to, it would be watching too much TV. And obviously it was too late for me already, but I was still moved by it. And it got me wondering, like, I think you once said that when the games era began, Nickelodeon made it clear that they wanted the show to be more fun. They didn't like when it got too frightening or too dramatic, but at the same time, like scenes of psychosis were still a hallmark of the show, and they continued to be part of the show. And you've got that sequence in My Shiny Friend where Stimpy is basically going through drug withdrawal. And my question about that is, did you have to, like, every time there was going to be a scene like that on the show, did you have to negotiate for it and determine exactly how far you could take it?
No. If I did, I don't remember. Vanessa Coffey was very good at defending me because I did come up more than once for certain problematic things that I would propose.
Hmm.
And I don't remember what they were, but there's probably some things I had to roll back. But that never bothered me too much because my theory was, John would just be like, he'd be destroyed if a certain joke wasn't in it, and he would force the issue and really try to have it, and he would risk his job. And I was like, I would just say, well, look at it this way. Use your brain, sit down with Jim, and write something funnier. Take it and make it more surreal. Put it in a direction where they don't get it. We got stuff by a lot of times because they didn't get the joke.
Hmm.
So that was a good thing to be forced to do as a writer, to take that as a challenge, not as like a deflation,
Yeah.
So it never really bothered me that much. And I would be surprised that certain things, like there was a certain innocence that they had there at Nickelodeon at that time, where they weren't trying to find stuff. I mean, John really had to shove it in his face for them to react.
Yeah.
They thought it was funny. It was funny. They had senses of humor. They were great people, and that he would say all this horrible things about them later is just like, that was just nonsense. It was, that guy could just never be happy. He was never, if he had to take it, like the animation when it came back for Sven Hoek was unbelievably good by Bob Jakes' crew. And John shows it to me and just says, what do you think of this? And I'm watching it, and I think it was this scene where the two of them were skipping along or something like that. And it was just fucking brilliant. And I said, this kind of reminds me of a parody somehow of the actual style of a Walt Disney smashed with the Warner Brothers happy-go-lucky scene in one of those little cartoons. It's brilliant. And he goes, no, you don't get it. So it was like somehow something in his mind, it had to be just this weird certain way that only he could see for him to be satisfied.
Hmm.
And that's what destroyed everything. That compulsion.
Yeah.
And by
Well,
the way, I wrote Man's Best Friend. I didn't get a credit for it, but I think it's kind of funny that that's the cartoon that helped take him down.
hmm. Um, there was so much bad blood around Ren and Stimpy. I know that's why for a long time you didn't feel like talking about anything having to do with Ren and Stimpy. But eventually you did participate in a couple of retrospective projects made by different people. There was Sick Little Monkeys, the book by Thad Komorowski. And then there was Happy Happy Joy Joy, the Ren and Stimpy story, which was a feature-length documentary. I wanted to ask how you think those two projects turned out as far as giving a good history of the show.
I thought they both were kind of, I don't know. I didn't participate much in the Thad book. I ended up painting the cover over a DeStefano drawing.
Hmm.
And I ended up doing an interview at a convention with him, with me and Bob. But I didn't even read the book until later. And I read it and I realized he just lambasted me at my cartoons. I mean, and I'm like, well, if you had, because Jim had said he seems like a nice guy, you should talk to him, and I didn't, so I felt like that he was particularly vehement with me because I didn't cooperate with him, and I've come to know him a bit and know that that's the kind of personality he has. But I would be the first one to agree that those problems are done by a green artist with no help from anybody else, and they show it. And things like My Shiny Friend, I was getting better. I had a little more help on that cartoon. It was a perfect premise. I put my heart and soul into it. And I like the last cartoon there a lot. It doesn't get a lot of notice because it didn't get in the first rounds of play, which was Sammy Mantis story.
Yeah.
But then I had figured it out. And then just as I had figured it out, it was done.
Yeah.
I think I would have made a four. I don't think I ever made a 4-star cartoon. I think I came to about 3.5, maybe 3. But I think it would have if we'd gone on for a few years,
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Well, there's one last Ren and Stimpy topic I wanted to ask about, and I'm sure you knew this was coming. I wanted to ask about the ill-fated reboot. Are you at liberty to talk about that?
no, no, I'm not. Unfortunately, they threatened to sue me because I signed a non-disclosure. Now, I think I can make some statements about what's actually happened. Like they made the cartoon. They took 2 years to do it, and ordinarily it takes a year. And the network decided not to release it.
Hmm.
So I think you can gather why they may have chosen not to release it. Um, and I think I can say in the broadest terms, Bob, Jim, and I were hired under certain circumstances that uh, they decided at a certain point in time that we weren't going to be allowed to do those original agreed upon circumstances. So then we were no longer working for them.
Hmm.
And I won't say specifically what I thought of the content and get into stories about what happened.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's smart.
Okay. Well, to turn things to a happier subject, I'd like to ask you about Monroe because I think, as far as your cartooning work, it's kind of your magnum opus, in my opinion. For those who don't know, Monroe was a regular strip that Bill drew for Mad Magazine for about 10 years, and stories were usually 3 or 4 pages long. And earlier I said Cracked Magazine had like an alternative comics period. I thought Monroe was kind of like Mad having its own alternative comic as a regular feature. And it really stood out that way. And it also stood out because it was basically about a kid who was like Mad's target audience. He was a junior high schooler, later aged up into a high schooler. He was lower middle class. He wasn't really a nerd, but he was a misfit, no girlfriend, bad home life. Going back and rereading some of those, I thought, this was really the only piece of pop culture, or at least cartoon at the time, that had some honesty about what life was like for kids back at the turn of the millennium and into the 2000s. Because the kids sounded like real kids, they had attitudes like real kids, compared to TV or movies, and definitely compared to comics or cartoons. Like I could definitely relate more to Monroe than Hey Arnold or Zitz or something like that. And it had a total lack of sentimentality, and it was brutally hilarious and really cynical and sordid. It really embraced the sordidness of adolescence. And your art just complemented all that stuff perfectly because it was so amazingly beautifully ugly. And you could really feel like Monroe's angst in every page. And it's really unfair that there's never been a Monroe collection in book form. They never even did a super special. But what can you tell us about the genesis of Monroe? Did they already have the concept and they were just looking for a writer and artist? Or was it Tony Barbieri's concept, the writer of the series? Did he choose you as the artist?
It was Tony's baby. He came to Mad with it, I believe. No, of course he had to. He brought it to Mad. Mad had already. I'd been flirting with Mad for years. They tried to hire me away from Cracked sometime before that, and I came into the office and met Nick and John, and they said, "Hey, we love your work at Cracked." And I'm like, "Oh, well, thanks." And you know, we're kind of interested in you, but what you would need to do is quit working for Cracked. Would you be willing to do that? And I said, "Well, yeah, to work for Mad." Well, we're not offering you a job. So this was some game that they were playing, and
Mm-hmm.
they just wanted to hurt Cracked, and they thought if they got rid of me, that would hurt them. And I like to think that was true to some degree, but they still had Severin, so I think they would have lived just fine without me. But I said, well, they give me a lot of work. I have the stories in every issue. I have the back cover of every issue. I have the occasional cover for a special, and even occasional cover for the actual comic. magazine. No, I would have to know I'm doing something here for you. And they said, well, we can't guarantee you any work. So I said, okay, sorry. I couldn't believe it, but I just was like, it's a pragmatic decision.
Yeah.
I made good money at Cracked, so it was like covering my rent and, and my school and everything. So it was like, okay. And I was having fun most of the time. That wasn't my first dealings with them. I had gone in once, and I don't remember the interview at all, where all I got to see was Lenny Brenner, that guy, and didn't get any further than that. And then I got a call from Joe Orlando, and he asked me if I wanted to pencil some samples, and he gave me a script, and it was a political thing with Bill Clinton. And I did a couple pages of that, and he didn't like them. And at that time, I was back in LA, and Ren and Stimpy had blown up, and I got lucky. I got a call to art direct Space Jam, and I was working on that, and I get a call from a new art director at Mad named Kaboom Snyder, and he was like, "Listen, we've got this strip idea. We've got a good writer, but he doesn't understand comic book formats. And to be honest with you, we don't really understand them." And I said, "What do you mean you don't understand it?" Because I'm talking about doing something that's moment to moment, that's real time, that's its own strip. Everything else has always been movie parodies and you're stupid if all this kind of thing. And they said, "We like your comics."
Mm-hmm.
So I think they'd seen Big Blonde Baby, and they just knew I could do it. So they said, "Would you take the scripts and turn them into comic scripts and draw the thing?" And I said, "Well, that's interesting, but I'm art directing this sort of little movie that's that I can't just suddenly leave. But let me design some characters, and maybe I can find a way to. Maybe this will take some time anyway." So I drew up the Monroe character and sent it to them, and they liked it. And then they said, "Well, there's going to be a pause." And I said, "Well, why is that?" "Well, we're waiting for Joe Orlando to retire. For some reason, he has a problem with you." And I don't know why. I think it was just because he didn't like my sample, so I was out. I don't know. Maybe I rubbed him the wrong way somehow. Not impossible thing for me.
Yeah.
So there was some time that went by, and Space Jam was a big clusterfuck, but I managed to solve some design problems that put me in good with Ivan Reitman. But then Ivan's way of getting more time would be to be suddenly difficult about saying yes to a certain design part of the movie. And then end up blaming the art director, because there'd been a series of art directors. I was like the third one, I think. And I'm getting off onto a tangent here, but this is a guy who I was at the table talking to him about something else. I had just designed the spaceship, and he liked it, which everyone was astonished, because he had hedged on that for a year. And they said, "Oh, I got to interrupt, Ivan." His assistant said, "Yeah, what's that?" And he goes, the Mobius art came in. These giant paintings by Gerard, the Mobius guy, are laid out on the table in front of him. I mean, they're fucking magnificent. They're the villain's lair and all these different things, but they look spooky. But as Ivan would his favorite phrase was, "Where's the funny? I don't see the funny." He wanted design, and that's why I worked pretty well with him. He wanted guys who could do realistic that was funny, not just realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Mobius has done some humorous stuff, but it's a little bit dour. It's not broad,
Yeah.
So, or whimsical. I don't know how you describe Major Fatale, but anyway, that was the kind of casualness he had with things that were. I imagine each presentation piece was $5,000 or $10,000 each, and he looked through them like he was looking through playing cards. And he goes, "Where's the funny?" Oh, the minion is like, hemming and hawing, and he goes, "Does he do changes?" I said, "No, he doesn't do changes." You could just tell he wanted to explain that this is the guy who designed Alien, and and it's like, doesn't do changes. Okay, fuck it. And that was the end of it. He probably never looked at that. They never looked at that art again. But once it was my turn to be the art director who was the problem at a certain point. And then but then I had a reprieve because they decided to fire the director instead. I mean, this co-director instead. And they had hired me. So now they had this other guy in there who was in there to get the goddamn cartoon done because we'd been spending millions. And I went into his office. I was a little cocky, and I explained to him what he needed to do to get this thing finished because I knew he didn't really know what was going on. And he got mad and fired me because he didn't like my attitude and proceeded to do exactly what I told him to do to get the film done. But right at that point, I'm out of a job. And then Mad called back and said, "Hey, Joe retired. And so you want to do the strip?" "Yeah, okay." And then they're like, "We want you to package the strip." I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, just do the whole thing. You're just responsible for it all. Send us all in. You do the lettering. You do the." I said, "Oh, can I hand lettering?" "No, but find somebody to do the lettering." And I said, "Well, I don't want to do your shitty same old Mad lettering. Can I play around with the fonts?" And because I had seen that book that was done at Image. I think it was done at Image, or Todd McFarlane had something to do with it. It was a Kiss comic. Did you ever see that?
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the first time I noticed that they were taking, fonts, computer fonts had become the thing. And Richard Starkings was doing some nice stuff. And they were having different characters speak with different fonts. And I thought, to a certain degree, I saw that as being something as a bit pretentious and a little confusing. But I thought, no, I think if you're judicious with this, you can use it to really identify things and make things funnier. So they said, "That sounds too complicated to us. You handle it. We'll give you a budget to just get the lettering done." I'm like, "Okay." And then they said, "You got to make it work for the format with the writing." So I was allowed to rewrite the material. Suddenly I was the editor on this thing.
Wow.
And that's a dangerous thing to do with me. And I'm sure there's plenty of times where I rewrote Tony and he was not happy with it. And then I would have arguments with editorial because, of course, they were mad guys are formula, They were kind of like, they loved the same ending on things, like, riding off into the sunset, kind of, repeated gags that were, Spy versus Spy was great, but it was the same joke for 50 years, right?
Yeah.
They like that. That works for them. And I wanted the thing to progress. If you remember the strip, she started out kind of thin and beautiful, and then she got more flousy and fatter and drunker and, slovenly and promiscuous and all that stuff.
We're talking about Monroe's mom, of course.
Monroe's mom, yeah. And that's sometimes I stuck really close with Tony's stuff. Sometimes I went off on a tangent, and often I had to argue with editorial, which would get anybody else fired. But Monroe took off for what Mad sales were not where they should be anymore. But the strip they told me themselves that it was the most popular strip in the magazine. And so I would argue for certain things, and I'm sure I would have been fired by John if it wasn't for Nick Meglin. He believed in me. Now, he took me aside, and more than once, he said, "You've got to stop being quite so forceful. You can't be this way." And he didn't say it, but people who are like you, we don't put up with it. We fired them, but we don't want to fire you. And best that translation was, I don't want to fire you, because he knew John wanted to. This is my theory. And I am what I am, and I trying to do things the way I felt it should be. And I, as you saw from the artwork, I put everything I had into it. Until the fateful day, they call me up and they say, well, we fired the art director, the one who got me in, Kaboom Snyder. And we have a new art director. And I'm like, who is that? And that's Sam Viviano. And Sam was a stalwart regular there, a pretty good cartoonist, but not terribly original style. Do you know his work?
I don't think so.
Yeah, well, that's why you don't know it, because it doesn't really stand out. If you look him up, you'll go, oh yeah, I think I've seen that kind of stuff before. He looked like a little mix of everybody.
Oh yeah, I do remember seeing his stuff in Mad back then. Yeah,
yeah, but at that same time, Nick Meglin had retired, and I should tell you, they had Sergio Aragonis give me a talk about not being an asshole.
Whoa.
And to be happy about that I'm at Mad and how this is the opportunity of a lifetime and all that. And they had Mort Drucker do it too.
Oh no.
Nick says, hey, you want to meet Mort Drucker? And I'm like, yeah, we'll come to the National Cartoonist thing. We're sitting down there having lunch, and then Nick just goes, I need to go in here and go do something for a while. And then, he figuratively, Drucker throws his arm around me and gives him the speech. He gives me the speech of like, these guys can be difficult and this, that, but Mad is the greatest opportunity for any cartoonist. They change my stuff too, and it's just like, toe the line, kid.
Wow.
And we ended up corresponding after that. He was a super nice guy. And it was like, Mort Drucker, my God, hero of all heroes, of many. And so Sam gets in and just starts telling me how to draw the strip. Panel by panel, face by face, pose by pose. And it's just like, oh, this ain't going to happen. It's going to happen. That's why they hired him. They said, you're going to put the bit in his mouth, and that's all there is to it. But he would do stuff like, why do you have reaction panels? In fact, he didn't even call it a reaction panel. He would say, why do you have a character say something and then the other person just look at them and not say anything? And I said, that's called a reaction shot. Oh, well, don't do that. And I'm like, I couldn't help myself. This was like when we were first talking. I guess Charles Schultz got it all wrong. That's where I got it from. I got it from, Peanuts.
Yeah.
He did reaction shots all the time. He let the viewer look at that, and they were knowing exactly what the character was thinking from their expression and how he'd set it up. He didn't get that. He didn't get that the logo was a parody of Kilroy Was Here, and that I repeated it in the strip whenever Monroe felt uncomfortable about talking to his slutty mother. You might remember he would like look over the couch and you wouldn't see his whole face.
Yeah.
And he would say, why don't you show his whole face? And I said, but it's the Kilroy thing, and he's embarrassed that this tramp is his mother, and he doesn't want to look at her lying there half naked. He's just embarrassed to be in that room with her. His parents, he's ashamed of them. That's the premise. Didn't get it. And he was just like saying, just draw everything straight on, and with your heads looking at us and stuff like that. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And he goes, no, that's what I want you to do. And I'm like seething, and he just goes, I make these changes with Mort Drucker too. And I'm like, you do not do that. and he goes, yeah. And he's very much a wannabe Mort Drucker, Jack Davis clone.
Oh yeah. I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, we butted heads so hard that I basically quit the thing.
Wow. Well, yeah.
He said you're farming it in. I said, well, you've broken my back. He says, you got to go back to putting in all the detail. This is starting to look more like Harvey Kurtzman or something. And if you look back at the strip, the last year of it, I was hacking it out. And it wasn't bad. And I talked to the writer and he says, do you think I'm hacking the strip out? Goes, no, that's fine. It seems fine to me. It's just the kind of thing that if you were looking to find a problem, and if you really were all about a little extra shading or something, I wasn't doing it, But he had broken me in that I didn't want anything changed. So literally by making me dumb it down, he was turning it into something he no longer even liked. But somehow that was my fault. And so I just said, I'm going to leave the strip. And not only am I going to leave the strip, I'll draw it for a month or two so you can get somebody to take my place. But you're going to give me a bonus at the end. And they did. They paid me for 1 month without doing anything. And I signed a piece of paper saying that they owned the rights to it, which they already did,
Yeah, well, I know it it chugged along for another couple of years after you left with another artist, but obviously that was the end of it. It's just crazy that you could have you were doing it for almost 10 years by that point when they started telling you your business of how Monroe needs to be done. But
and how they hired me in the first place as a contractor.
Yeah,
pack the strip.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's really too bad there was never a book. There's some official Mad compendiums of like where you can get every Mad issue digitally, but that and tracking down the old issues on eBay are pretty much the only way to get your hands on them. The strip ran from, I think, or you were on the strip from 97 to 2006. So those are the years to look for if you're collecting old Mads to read Monroe. Off the top of your head, did you have any favorite strips, the Monroe strips, stories?
I think the Black Boyfriend one was the one I liked the best because I was pushing it. It was almost, I'd have to say it was racist, really, in its depiction.
I remember it. I can picture it. Yeah, I remember that. I remember those drawings.
Yeah. I mean, I made it clear that he was well endowed in the pants, everything like that. It was like every racial stereotype without making his lips giant or something,
Yeah. Well, it seems like Mad was like going in an edgier direction at the time, and like a lot of pop culture, I guess. And maybe Monroe couldn't have happened at any other time in the magazine's history than when you were doing it.
Well, ironically, that was Jeanette Kahn's idea. She was concerned that Mad's sales were slipping and that it wasn't edgy enough, and she thought that would help the magazine. And I think she was right.
Yeah.
And so we were hired to be edgier and dirtier. And in fact, I was asked to do a pass at the cover, and they rejected it because it was way too edgy, and ended up using Alfred E. Newman Xeroxing his butt, right? But I did a portrait of him looking like he was a crystal meth addict just getting out of jail. He looked bad. And I feel weird about this, but Jack Davis quit because he didn't want to be part of the dirtier, edgier Mad. And
oh, wow.
I was that, along with Tony.
Huh.
and I think Jack was probably looking for a reason to retire at the same time, kind of. But,
Wow. Yeah. Something else I discovered in research for this is that Tony Barbieri was Mole in Windy City Heat, which I'd never known. And I don't have time to explain what Windy City Heat is, but Perry Caravello, that whole saga. But if you know, you know. And if you don't know, check out the movie Windy City Heat. And Tony Barbieri is Mole. That's the Monroe creator there.
Yeah, and he's an important writer on Jimmy Kimmel Forever.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to ask a little about some post Ren and Stimpy animation stuff. We mentioned King Crab, and I think that pilot was created as maybe something for a more adult-oriented comedy series, and it didn't get picked up, but it also was made before Adult Swim, before Cartoon Network really had a place for that kind of humor. At the same time, though, I feel like Adult Swim's never done a really cartoony adult oriented comedy series that, looks like something like King Crab. Do you think the industry is just afraid to produce something that's cartoony and visually appealing, but is also an adult comedy?
Well, let me tell you how it came about. Oh gosh, God, I hate getting old. Who's the guy who created Adult Swim? The
Mike
executive.
Mike Lazo?
Yeah,
Or
Mike Lazo. Mike Lazo. Um, I don't know how I got in front of Mike Lazo, but I did. And we talked, and this is going to sound pretty self-serving, but he had a general idea of trying to do more edgier cartoons. And I swear to you, this is my memory, and I could be wrong. We kind of hammered out the idea of Adult Swim. I didn't come up with the name, anything like that, but wait, I'm pretty sure I was the one who said run it later at night, and we can do the King Crab cartoon as the lead cartoon. And he was 100% for it. And I thought, fuck, okay, now we've got something. And then this was at this point, it was just pitch art, right? And premise. So he said, I want to rewrite it, and I want you to work with my two writers. Those are the two writers who worked on Space Ghost Coast to Coast. That was an iteration of Lazo's that was kind of like him,
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted them involved. So I said, okay, but I'd like to have a guy I want to work with, and that's Robert Loren Fleming, the guy I mentioned before. We all got together in Hollywood, and we started kicking around my original premise. And we got it into shape after a week, and we're pretty happy with it. And Mike seemed happy with it. But the thing that was a little bit irritating was those writers, they took the opportunity of being in Hollywood to pitch their own shit behind Mike's back. He didn't know that. They were around trying to do other shit. And so I didn't think we got their full attention there, and we didn't really come to a satisfactory conclusion on how we were going to do this show and exactly how it was going to go. And to make a very long, convoluted story short, they were supposed to work on rewriting it with me for months afterwards, and it just didn't seem to happen. And then they finally took a pass at it, and they completely changed it. And then Mike asked me, basically, I want to do it my guy's way, which was the premise was that King Crab ran a spaceship that was a garbage truck in space. And that's not what I was trying to do. I was trying to do Star Trek, really.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of Star Trek meets Ren and Stimpy in a way. And that was before there'd been a million Star Trek parodies and such, but that was my main inspiration. And the pilot's a little bit incoherent because it got shortened, and so things kind of jumped from here to there. But that was an Alien parody too, obviously. But that's kind of what I wanted to do, which was to do an episodic kind of parody of everything science fiction with the King Crab character. And then the story was going to be, when you see the, do you remember did you read the Happy comics? Did you get a copy of it?
Yeah.
Do you remember the King Crab in there?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a bit different.
Yeah. Well, it's much more adult, but again, that's kind of where it was supposed to go originally. And the relationship with the captain and his second in command was going to be a built-in villain. So he had this thing over his head that when they were starving to death, he had eaten his legs. And King Crab always felt guilty about that. And so that's why you could have your villain as your second in command. And I thought that was a pretty nice thing to do, a pretty easy thing to do. So there would be one episode where there might be an overall bigger villain, but in a way he would always side with the villain instead of siding with King Crab, and King Crab felt too guilty to punish him for it, in a specific way, like kicking him off the show or whatever. Anyway, that was my premise of
Yeah.
it. And they
But
just threw that out the window. And then I said, I don't like that. Can we continue to rewrite it? And then Mike passively aggressively just let me sit around for a couple months. And so I rewrote it on my own and sent it to him. He read it and then got back to me and fired me. So that was that. But I literally went through a year of development. They wanted to do it,
yeah.
but they really wanted me to kind of just be the art director, when it
Mm-hmm.
really came down to it. If I had been really flexible and let his guys really take the lead on the writing, I'd have had a show. But I didn't think they were funny.
Yeah, with the pilot that did get made, I mean, it's a really beautiful looking little pilot, and I just got to say, the Indian doctor woman, Dr. Deli, who's also an alien somehow, in addition to being Indian. I just wanted to acknowledge how inspired the detail was of having her bindi be a prehensile appendage, and you probably couldn't do that. You probably couldn't do that character today for several reasons, but she's one of the highlights.
Well, it was caricature, and it was so you could borderline say, well, that's kind of racist. And in particularly what I did, which was I did audition an Indian actress. And the non-Indian actress I thought was funnier because she was doing a broader making fun of an Indian accent, which I thought was just, she simply was a funnier actress than the actual, but I was really asking for it in that. But back then they weren't quite so sensitive yet, so that I may have gotten away with it. I don't know. But
well, that was still some years before people decided to get upset about a poo on The Simpsons, so probably would have been fine.
yeah. And I would have enlarged her character, more than she was. She wasn't just the love interest; she was going to be a main driving character. But
Sure. Well, another post Ren and Stimpy cartoon that I thought you did great work on was The Mighty Bee, which you also did some directing on it, and you once called it the best Ren and Stimpy influenced show. I think I agree. I think it's extremely underrated, and it's really unfair that Nickelodeon has never given it a proper DVD release. Why did things come together on that show? I mean, why did that manage to stand out as such a good kids cartoon, even with the limitations of TV?
Well, the creator, him and his wife were the producers, and he was She was responsible. She made herself head writer, and you can probably look up the credit for me.
Yeah, is that Cynthia True?
Yes, she was the head writer.
And Eric Weiss was the other.
Eric Weiss, yeah.
Weiss, sorry.
My apologies to Eric if he somehow hears this, but Cynthia doesn't like me anyway, so it doesn't matter. He hired me specifically because I was a Ren and Stimpy guy. He kind of wanted to hire John, but was afraid that John would try to take over, which he would have, So I was the no prize because Bob was busy doing something else, I think. I can't remember why they didn't try to approach Bob or if they did. But he approached me and said that he knew that if he tried to direct every cartoon himself, that he wouldn't be able to do it because he was a control freak and he wanted to control the boards and make them look like he drew everything. And all of that was going to be a monumental task. And he said, I want somebody who is kind of I don't know if he ever said this, but basically what I was the silent show co-showrunner. Because he took care of his cartoons, I took care of mine, so to speak, mine in quotes, right?
Yeah.
And so what I would do would be I wasn't allowed to work with the writers, which was dumbfounding. But Cynthia didn't like that Eric had hired me without talking to her. And they had some monumental rows. You would hear them going at each other. But I talk out of school because our relationship has been destroyed very recently, of all things. So I don't care anymore. But she didn't like me. She didn't like me being there. She didn't want to work with me. And I said, I'm not used to working in a situation where I'm supervising episodes and I can't talk to the writers. It doesn't make any sense. That's not how this game works.
Yeah.
Well, that's how it's going to have to work with you. So I already starting out with this handicap, but she wasn't a terrible writer herself, and her crew they were pretty good writers. All the ingredients were there. We would have had a wild success if she had just let me be in that room and been friends with me. But she didn't like me, and that was that. And because she didn't like me, I didn't like her. And
yeah.
I had told Eric this. I said, I am never going to be the source of trouble at this cartoon. I am going to be the source of making your life easier in every way. And I meant that. So I never told him that we had a problem. She probably told him, but I didn't come and complain to him. I would say, Eric, can you get me in the writer's room? Because we're all supposed to work together. Cartoons are collaborative medium, as you know. And he said, yeah, she doesn't want you in there. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, But we would take the writing, and she didn't like her writing changed, but it needed to be changed. But we couldn't change it, so we would gag it up. We'll keep the dialogue in there and fill it out and make it work better. And I worked with Eddie Trigueros, who was the head of the storyboard department, and on my cartoons, right?
Uh-huh.
And he would work with the director, the showrunner, with his cartoons, and I went over every single storyboard. I did what's called beat boards, where you look over the script and you do little thumbnails for the storyboard artists that flesh it out more, that give ideas for a visual joke that's not in the script, atmosphere, anything you can think of to plus it. So that's where I was, instead of in the writer's room saying these things to them and having the writers do it, I found a way to squeeze it in surreptitiously, shall we say.
Yeah.
And Eddie, I wish more people knew about this guy. He's an incredible cartoonist. He was so funny. We had so much fun working together. And when I was stuck on an idea, like, how do we make this work? This one's really not working. He'd have an idea, and then vice versa, And it would always be something like totally left field. Like, I don't see how to make he would come in, I don't see how we can make this one funny. And I said, we're going to make this one a drama. What? Yeah. But it's going to be the kind of drama that, is ridiculous. But oh yeah, that'll work, So we really clicked like that. And we went over each board with the guys and we double teamed them. They didn't like it, but we edited the storyboards fairly hard. And one day I'm called into the office. The first cartoons were coming out and they were very, very successful. The numbers were good for a new cartoon and the feedback was good. We figured out on this, getting ready for the second year, that there was too much of Amy Poehler in the first year. It was just that high screaming voice on the main character was a bit much to just have constant. So in year 2, I don't know if you noticed, you have to watch all of them, but suddenly the dog and the brother become bigger characters. And then the show was balanced after that. Mm. And so we were just starting to figure it out. Shows need time like that. Seinfeld sucked at first and then got great, and that was happening with us. But the problem was Cynthia. She was as difficult as she was with me, and I won't tell you any more stories about that. I'm already talking enough shit. But she would publicly be difficult with the network people. And so we were all fired off the show.
Wow.
And I was promised to direct my own cartoons, but since the whole thing was scuttled, I just got co-director credit, and Eric finished all of them. But I was supposed to finish these cartoons top to bottom. But basically, I supervised them up to post, and then he took it from there. Because, he just wanted to do as much of it as he could do before it was gone.
Yeah.
And it was unfortunate that show was great and was getting better and getting better.
Yeah. You once said in an interview that with regards to the legacy of Ren and Stimpy, that you were part of a team that brought cartoons back. My question about that is, are cartoons still back or have they gone away again?
Well, I don't watch them, so yeah, I'm the wrong person to
Mhm.
to ask. Um, I think the last cartoon feature I watched was The Incredibles. Maybe one other one, which I loved. I loved The Incredibles. A crushing blow for me was not getting the art direction on Iron Giant. I tried to dovetail uh, uh,
Space Jam.
Space Jam, thank you, to that.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that I was fired off of it hurt me. But anyway, I just thought we went wrong once we got into making the cartoons so freaking digitally realistic. Like how hair fell on a character was more, how many strands of hair became more important than an appealing character and a funny story. You know,
Yeah.
it was all about the rendering. And it's like when hand drawn animation went away for all that shit, I was just like, I'm not interested. You know, at first I enjoyed Toy Story. I like some things. I thought that makes sense. Toy Story, those look like toys. This is great. I was on
Yeah.
board for a while, but then when it just everything had to be that way, it was amazing how quick stuff started to look the same. You know, to me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And
uh,
then also on TV, so much stuff is digitally rigged now and it looks very phony and robotic.
I'll say one thing more about the uh, without passing any judgment. They wanted to digitally rig Ren and Stimpy. That's all I'm going to say. And we were not in agreement with that.
Yeah. I wouldn't think so. Um, well, I'd like to begin wrapping this up by asking you a couple things about your fine art, even if I lack the vocabulary and the education for it, but I'll do my best in layman's
Well,
terms.
so do I.
I think fans of your comics and animation would actually find a lot to appreciate in your paintings, and I would recommend everybody visit williamray.com after they finish this video, where you can see some high-resolution scans of them. Just as a casual observer, I think there's a connection between your fine art and your cartooning. The way you're able to use cartoony exaggeration in an expressionist way, or even in like your landscapes, your urban landscapes, the way you compose a scene and use color, it's not entirely removed from the background paintings you've done in animation.
Mhm.
Am I grasping at straws, or is there a relationship between good cartooning and making good fine art?
Well, I think that you're right on the money uh, in a certain way, except, and I couldn't shed it, but I was trying not to be the cartoonist in my painting, but I couldn't quite, not do it in a certain way.
Yeah.
Like what Glenn Barr, you know him, you know his
Hmm.
work.
Yeah.
Well, he was one of the. You probably remember because you're very thorough. He was one of the Ren and Stimpy background guys, and he went right into fine art, but kept doing it kind of cartoony and exactly in his cartoon style.
Hmm.
And I went into it and tried to shed all of that. And I thought about it. I thought, you could take these gross close-ups and you could get into that surrealist. What do they call that movement? It's still going on, kind of, but it's basically just exaggerated cartoons painted slightly real. It'll again, maybe it'll come to me in a minute, but I said, no, that's my day job. I don't want to do that. I want to do something totally different. And I kind of started out with typical to teach myself oil painting. I took some classes. Oh, I had oil painting in school, 20 years before, but 15 years before, but and that came back to me. But I wanted to do traditional stuff, and so I did what's called plein air painting, where you go out and you do paintings of. You just go down the street if you want and just paint anything. And I was into doing. I decided I didn't want to do. I did pretty paintings for a while, and I said, don't want to do that. Everybody does that. So I got into doing urban scenes of really rundown buildings and that kind of thing. And that hadn't been done too much. It's been done to death now. But back then I was a little bit on the sort of the forefront. I wasn't the only one, but I was kind of on the forefront of that. And I also always wanted to do something with superheroes, but I didn't know how to do that without it seeming just like the superheroes themselves. Posters for Marvel or whatever. So I don't want to do that. And I don't want to do them dead humorous. But then I remembered those Hollywood Boulevard guys, people who would dress up as superheroes to get tips from tourists. And so I did a lot of paintings of them and hired them for my models and would walk around Hollywood and photograph them in slightly offbeat situations. And just would, as soon as I get good at doing one thing and get popular with it at all, I quit and do something else because I have a self-destructive streak and I get bored. So like right now I'm at Loggerheads with one of my galleries because they want me to basically just stick with doing the work I was doing for them about 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago, and just repeat it. And I don't want to do it.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I wanted to ask is about your experiences as a fine artist in general. You've spoken before in other interviews about how when you first tried to study art in the 70s, the schools were turning out a lot of hucksters who were drawing their feelings and doing really hippy-dippy conceptual stuff. And they were shunning people who wanted to learn to paint and draw formally. And that was reflected elsewhere in the contemporary art world too, like looking down on illustrators like Frank Frazetta or Norman Rockwell. My question about that is, have art schools and the art world in general warmed up more to illustrative and traditional art than when you were first getting into it?
They didn't warm up to it. They were forced into it because too many of the artists wanted to do that. And it's just crept in the business, into the whole thing. But the very, very top places, and it's notable that a lot of them are closing, stuck to this obvious tradition, modern art, quote unquote, particularly in the 60s, was destroying the past conventions that you're just describing. And then after a while, they didn't even realize that they had become the convention, and they still are. And you still see people going into galleries and doing performance art of just a woman sitting in a circle with her pants off and draws a circle around herself or whatever. And, oh my God, it's that still exists. But all these different artists around the world, and particularly this has to do with the computer age of sharing and seeing stuff from around the world. Everybody wants to do some form of realism in their work and mix it up with modern abstraction and illustrative kind of ideas, more like in the horror vein and things like that. And there's this mishmash of all that stuff a lot of it's really good. And good means skill. And the thing about the days when skill was shunned, that was to make an equal playing field for the untalented who didn't want to work. But intellectually were smart, and they had a need to perform. And maybe they were, I used to call it, I think it was writer's art.
The painted
they have
word.
a concept and they don't know how to execute it in a painted way.
Yeah.
So they'll find some other way to do it. And there's that Chinese guy who screams at his painting every time he takes a brushstroke.
Wow. Never heard of him.
Stuff like that. It just makes no fucking sense.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff that's just like dancing on your painting. Like, so a woman will put out just a big canvas on the ground and, you know, spin a pirouette and paint, you know. And when you do things like that, when you mush around and paint, sometimes you can get sort of interesting abstract shapes from it, but it's not hard to do. But what's really gratifying is I used to be a bit more of a, I've said woman in a derisive way a couple times here. There's a ton of great young women artists who are now doing just what you're talking about. They want to do realistic too, mixed with a really good idea. And there's tons, it's now egalitarian, I think. It's 50-50 of talented male artists and talented female artists, and it's maybe even going the other way. Eventually the women will dominate. But there's also been this kind of thing where in the past, less talented women were forced, kind of pushed on everyone because they had been kind of ignored in that time period where talent didn't matter, but it just mattered if you were a dude. And then, so that was a genuine, back in in the 80s, there was this group called the Guerrilla Girls who was trying to get noticed because they were doing that artwork too, but because they were women, they weren't getting the gigs like men. So all that stuff was very real. But now it's like when my last gig in animation was art directing the Harley Quinn show about 5 years ago. I'll turn that. And I was told to hire women. And I said, there's tons of women on the staff already. Well, just hire nothing but women. That's what we're doing now. And if transsexuals had applied, I would have had to hire them too, even if the portfolio was bad. And I would say, I don't want to know if they're man or female. Can I just look at a portfolio? Nope. You got to hire women. So that was kind of the beginning of the whole woke thing got extreme. And it's like, it had a point. There was a point to it, but then they kind of abused it. You know, it's like, you can't just hire somebody because they're a woman or man or transsexual or whatever they are because of what they are. They have to have talent. And if they don't have talent, that means you don't want your product to be well done. But and that has everything to do with why the whole business went kablooey. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Bill, I think I've taken up more than enough of your time, I'm sure, but this has been such a privilege. Really, thank you so much for the opportunity and for being generous with your time and your honesty and all of your insights.
Well, I wanted to thank you for the research you've done. It was extensive. So I don't think you missed anything, really.
Well, it was my pleasure going back and rereading stuff like Monroe. So that was no trouble at all. If you got to the end of this video, folks, please leave a comment. Let us know what your favorite stuff is that Bill's worked on, and then go check out WilliamRay.com to see what he's been working on lately. And we will see you next time. Bill, thank you once again.
Yeah, come and say hi to me on Facebook or Instagram.
All right, take care.
Well, brother. Appreciate it.